Test it, test it.
This question may seem absurd to those who grew.
We're about to put it down, y'all. We're about to put it down. About to learn about the ancient black gods. Come on in. Share it live. We're gonna wait until we get a couple people up in here, man. Then we're gonna begin.
Grew up listening only to a version of sacred history. But what if I told you that the Bible, the ancient texts, and the archaeological records hide one of the greatest spiritual secrets of all time, a forbidden truth, suppressed and considered too dangerous to be told freely? I'm talking about the black gods, powerful beings revered in various millennial cultures who ruled the world long before the imposition of the figure of Yahweh as the only God. Throughout history, ancient peoples from different continents, from Africa to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to the Indo Valley, recorded the presence of black-skinned deities associated with creation, wisdom, judgment, and mastery over Earth's elements. But why were these figures, previously celebrated, were gradually erased from the books, renamed as demons, or simply omitted from the dominant theology?
Come on
What
in.
you will hear in this video
Share
is
the
not
live.
conspiracy
Press the like.
theory. It is revelation based on hidden texts, marginalized
Hit that
archaeology,
like, y'all.
and ancestral spiritual wisdom. Get ready to deconstruct ideas that may have been taught to you as absolute. The spiritual black identity, the deity of the African peoples, and the history of the forgotten gods were buried in centuries of religious and political colonization. But the echoes of truth still vibrate in the forgotten scriptures, the hidden inscriptions in ancient temples, and the traditions held hard by spiritualist communities around the world. If you think Yahweh was the first god of humanity, you might never have heard of the Egyptian Neteru, African Orishas, the Sumerian gods, and even the plural Elohim mentioned in the Old Testament. The question that many are afraid to ask is, why were so many records of black gods systematically erased, censored, or reinterpreted? What was so...
See, this is what they've been trying to keep. You understand me? It's like the Matrix, man. And the black man and woman on this planet, they're the Neos.
threatening in them? The erasure of the black gods was not a historical accident. It was a spiritual and political project of domination that involved empires, religions, and power systems. The imposition of a single white and male deity, replacing whole pantheons of black ancestors, is one of the greatest spiritual manipulations in the history of humanity. But now, this truth is coming to light. You are about to dive into a deep journey that will connect the pieces of this great puzzle. Let's explore what apocryphal books reveal about these beings. Let us decipher the role of fallen angels, understand the origins of the children of God mentioned in Genesis 6, and confront the stories that have been silenced over the centuries. This video is not just about religion, it is about spiritual awakening, reconnecting with the ancestry and liberation of spiritual colonial thinking. In the next few minutes, you will find out why this truth was considered too dangerous to count. You will understand why the figure of the black god had to be buried and what happens when this sacred memory is restored. And before we continue, think about it. What happens to a people when he loses the image of his own God? It changes everything. Your identity, your faith, your future. Don't leave. The next revelation can be the most disconcerting you have ever heard. And before we follow the next revelations, I want to hear your voice. Comment down here. Have you heard about the black gods? Do you believe there are spiritual truths that have been hidden from humanity? Your opinion is essential, not only to feed the debate, but to show the algorithm that this type of content needs to reach more awake people like you. And if this video has already brought you a new perspective, leave your like right now. It helps too much to spread this message. Subscribe to the channel so as not to lose the sequence of this revealing content, because what comes next will further deepen this prohibited truth. Each like, every comment, and each new registration strengthens this search engine community that are not content with what has always been told. We are rewriting the spiritual history of humanity, and you are part of it. Let's go together. Now that you have understood how hidden this truth has been, we need to go back to the beginning. Before the great monotheistic religions were consolidated, even before Yahweh was established as the only God over all, there were others. I do not speak here of isolated myths or folkloric legends, but of millennial records, powerful spiritual narratives that reveal the performance of cosmic beings described as black gods, spiritual ancestors who ruled whole kingdoms with wisdom, order, and mystery. And their story begins in the deep roots of Africa, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. In the African tradition ancestral, the spiritual was not separated from everyday life. Oryxas, for example, are not only seen as religious entities, but as living manifestations of divine forces. They have personalities, functions, stories, and most importantly, they have color, have African features, have black ancestry. Oxala, Shango, Obatala, Olorum. How many of these names have already been demonized by systems they did not understand or did not want the world to understand? The spiritual depth of an entire continent. Africa is the cradle of humanity, but it is also the cradle of the oldest spirituality.
See, we got to understand, y'all, that there was a time when there was nothing on this planet but the black man and woman. So when these Neanderthal spawns came about and they started seeing the temples and they started seeing the black man and woman, we were their gods, literally.
There came the first records about black deities, and it was no coincidence. These records were not only in village or orally between griots. They are in papyrus, sculptures, altars, temple walls, kings, so-god bones, and even in rock art. The worship of black gods crossed centuries, even before the Bible had been written. In ancient Egypt, for example, we find the Neteru, deities that formed a kind of heavenly advice. They were not allegories. They were worshipped as real entities with mastery over cosmic laws, nature, death, and life. Isis, Osiris, Anubis, Thoth, many of them represented with black features, dark bodies, wide noses, curly hair, ebony skin. They were symbols of strength, wisdom, and transcendence. But what is most intrigued is that these same Neteru have very strong parallels with the Anunnakis of Mesopotamia, who are also described as gods coming from heaven, descendants of a cosmic divine lineage. Many Sumerian texts talk about these dark-skinned beings, like burnt bronze, intense eyes, and a presence that made kings bend their knees. And the most impactful, they not only visited the earth, they ruled it. They taught agriculture, mathematics, time control, astronomy, the construction of pyramids and ziggurats, knowledge that to this day modern science can barely explain how soon they came up in civilizations considered primitive. How to explain, for example, that people separate by oceans. Africans, Egyptians, Sumerians, Hindus, and even Mayan have all recorded the coming of heaven beings with powerful appearance, dark skin, and dominion over the laws of the universe. Why do everyone talk about gods who descended to teach, organize, rule, and then left, promising to come back? What's more, why, when Yahweh appears in the Bible, he comes into direct conflict with other gods, ordering his destruction, his overthrown, altars, and his names erased from collective memory? The answer may be in the biblical text itself, which recognizes the existence of other gods, although it treats them as rivals. Remember Psalm 82, where Yahweh gathers a divine assembly and says, "You are gods, children of the Most High, but shall you die like men?" The question that remains is, who are these gods? Where did you come from? Why does Yahweh confront them if he is the only true God? The story is there, but no one wants to talk about it. The Bible even carries hidden clues in names, genealogies, and even poorly translated original words. The Elohim, for example, a word used for God in Hebrew, is in the plural. That's right, plural, a term that literally means the gods. Why has this translation have been ignored or softened over the centuries? Perhaps because admitting that there was a divine plurality before the monotheistic imposition would destabilize a whole structure of spiritual, political, and social power. But when we look at the beginning of everything, the records are clear. There were black gods, sovereign creators, mysteries revealing, and they were not local inventions. They manifested in various cultures under different names, but with a common core. They were superior beings who came from distant places, many say from heaven, from the stars, or even other dimensions, to govern and teach humans. They were the first kings, the first priests, the first spiritual legislators. His presence shaped the world until they are replaced, and were not replaced by anyone. They were erased for a new spiritual paradigm to take account of the planet. The imposition of monotheism with Yahweh as a central figure was the milestone of a new era. But this new age required the old gods to be destroyed, their stories considered heresy, their demonized images. The transition was so aggressive that to this day, who dare to study these themes are labeled as heretic, conspiracy, or crazy. But you who are here listening to me now, you know there is something inside you awakening, a feeling that they told you only part of the story, that your spirituality may be linked to a much older and deep divine lineage, that there is a sacred memory hidden within your spirit, hoping to be reactivated. This is not just a journey of knowledge. It is a journey of I find who you really are. And this needs to be said. When you know the origin of the black gods, you start to understand why they were erased. You realize the fear that religious empires had a people aware of their ancestral deity. For a people who see himself as a child of gods, who recognizes himself as a spiritual descendant of black heavenly kings, does not easily bend before systems that enslave body and mind. Therefore, this video is more than information. It is a call, an awakening. And if you are here so far, you have been touched by this energy. You feel that something bigger is coming. But this is just the beginning. Next time, let's dive even deeper into this mystery and show you how these gods have left visible marks to this day, in cultures, in the bodies, in words, and even in heavens. Before we continue, tell me here in the comments, do you believe that black gods were really the first rulers of the earth? Right there, the forbidden truth is being revealed. It shows me that you are with me on this journey. And of course, if you haven't left like or signed up, do it now. Thus, the algorithm understands that this content needs to be spread, because this truth can no longer be silent. Let's go. You are beginning to realize that it is not just ancient mythology or forgotten cultures. What we are uneasizing here is a spiritual war of cosmic proportions, a dispute between narratives, heavenly powers, between what was remembered and what was strategically erased. The existence of the black gods was not only silenced by secular history, it was suppressed in a manner calculated from the sacred scriptures themselves, the texts that today form the basis of the faith of billions of people. If you have already wondered why certain books have not entered the Bible, why entire passages have been excluded or adapted over the centuries, you are not alone. And the answer, as you will understand now, has everything to do with these ancient gods, these dark-skinned spiritual entities that have dominated the heavens and the earth in immemorial times. They were mentioned, yes, only not the way you think. And when the truth began to emerge, it was sealed, hidden, censored. The apocryphal texts, those who were considered not official or too dangerous to be part of the Bible, you know, are full of information about these beings. Enoch's own book, which was accepted by several Jewish and Christian communities in the early centuries, brings a disturbing revelation. The vigilants, also called fallen angels, descend from heaven and join the daughters of men. But what few people realize is that these vigilantes are described as gods, endowed with wisdom, power, and imposing appearance. They taught spiritual secrets, technologies, magic, reading of the stars. They interfered directly on human destiny. And why was that so problematic? Because these beings did not fit the monotheistic model that would consolidate with Yahweh as a single God. They were many, they were powerful, they were black, and the most impactful, they were loved by whole people. Therefore, they needed to be rewritten as villains, as fallen, as dangerous. The Book of Enoch, in exposing this truth, was rejected from the official councils. Even today, it is one of the most censored texts of Judeo-Christian tradition, although accepted and revered by some Ethiopian communities, not by chance, one of the oldest peoples linked to the spiritual African lineage. The Jubilee book follows the same pattern. There is also talk of spiritual figures that came from above and guided humanity, deities that interfered in the order of the world. Many of these figures appear as angels, but the language used in the original manuscripts makes it clear that these were heavenly beings with divine authority, and that many of them fell into misfortune not for evil, but for the sake of humanity. They brought knowledge that, according to dominant theology, men could not have. They opened the eyes of humans. They aroused conscience, and that's why they needed to be erased. But how do you erase an entity that lives in the memory of a people? You don't erase, you rewrite, you change your name, you transform into demon what before it was God. You say the power he brings is forbidden. You institute fear as a tool of faith. And so the black gods were pushed to the backstage of the story. They did not disappear, were forcibly hidden. The few times they appear in official scriptures appear as enemies of Yahweh, as rivals, such as idols, as threats. But that only raises more questions. If they never existed, why so much effort to combat them? Gnostic writings, found in Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, brought to light texts that had been considered heretical for centuries. There, we found descriptions of beings called archontes and aeons, who ruled the material world and interfered with creation. Some of these texts suggest that the creative God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, was not the supreme being, but an inferior entity that assumed power to force, and that above him there were others, older, more conscious, more fair, and many of them had shapes that refer to the black deities of the past. Do you start to realize what was done? A true spiritual erasure, where the black gods, the guardians of ancestral knowledge, the masters of the primitive earth, were removed from the Bible to give way to a single, centralized, dominant, imposing figure. Yahweh does not appear alone. It comes in confrontation. He arises, ordering, destroying altars, knocking down idols, silent priests. And the texts that told the other side of history were classified as dangerous, prohibited, heretic, unworthy of faith. But the truth has a force that no council can bury forever. Today, with the manuscripts of the Dead Sea, the documents of the...
Why do you think they try so hard to erase the memory of the black man and woman, the cream of the universe in America?
Nag Hammadi Library, the texts preserved in Ethiopia, and the African oral traditions, we have access to what for centuries has been hidden. The question is, are you ready to see with new eyes what have you taught to fear? Because everything changes when you understand that perhaps the forbidden truth is not dangerous because it is wrong, but for being liberating. This is exactly why, for centuries, any narrative that pointed to the black deity was fought with violence, censorship, and distortion. What is at stake is not just theology, it is power. Because those who control the image of God control the mind and soul of millions. What if God is black? What if African spirituality is the key to reconnecting humanity to its original purpose? What if the texts we reject contain the answer that modern religious cannot offer? Do you feel it? Does this fire lit within you? This discomfort that at the same time restless and awakens, this is the call, and it echoes through the centuries. The black gods were not destroyed, they were silenced. And now their voices are resurfaced through each search engine who refuses to accept a fragmented, manipulated, and incomplete narrative. He comments down here, forbidden books reveal the truth. This phrase only helps spread this awakening. Tell me, did you already know the Book of Enoch? Do you believe these truths have been hidden on purpose? Have you ever stopped to think why so many biblical passages talk about other gods and never clearly explain who these beings were? Why Yahweh, supposedly the Almighty God, appears several times in the ancient texts in a direct confrontation posture with spiritual entities called gods or Elohim. The truth that many scholars and religious leaders avoid playing for fear or convenience. Nay, is that the Old Testament is full of hidden references to a heavenly war, a spiritual and territorial dispute between Yahweh and other deities who already dominated people and territories long before the monotheistic revelation. These deities are called Elyon, a Hebrew term meaning the very high. They are spiritual beings who had authority over entire nations. Each people, every culture, every civilization had their own deity, their spiritual laws, their covenants with the gods. And Yahweh, who arises more explicitly from Abraham, presents himself as the God of Israel, not as the only God of all peoples ever since. This in itself already dismantles the narrative that Yahweh was the only one from the beginning. It arises in a context of territorial and theological dispute, and this dispute was not metaphorical, it was real. The ancient texts indicate that there were spiritual layers organized in hierarchies, a true divine council composed of several higher entities who participated in heavenly decisions and had mastery over specific aspects of creation. And one of the most revealing texts of this hidden spiritual war is in Psalm 82, one of the most mysterious and misplaced chapters of the entire Bible. Psalm 82 describes a shocking scene. God is in the midst of the advice of gods. Yes, you heard right. The text says, God stands in the congregation of the gods, among the gods' judges. And soon after, Yahweh begins to rebuke these other gods, accusing them of injustice, of favoring the wicked, and neglecting the weak and oppressed. And then comes the sentence, you are gods, children of the Most High, but as men you will die. Guys, now stop for a second and think about it. Why would Yahweh say to these beings, you are gods? Why does he threaten them by saying that they will die like men? What kind of being needs to be remembered of your deity and at the same time warned of your imminent fall? This is the moment when the mask of traditional history falls. Psalm 82 is not just an old poetry. It is a direct record of a clash between Yahweh and other heavenly beings, considered authentic gods. And the most disturbing, some scholars point out that these gods were the same ones who were worshipped by the ancient peoples before the imposition of faith in Yahweh. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, contains several passages that allude to this divided spiritual structure. In Deuteronomy 32, for example, we find the statement that the Most High divided the nations and designated a deity to each people, but chose Israel to themselves. This literally means that Yahweh was not the God of all peoples. He was the God of a specific people. The rest of the nations had other spiritual rulers. Then the inevitable question arises: who were these other regions? Why were they erased? And why did Yahweh come into war with them? The reason is clear: a spiritual war for the dominion of the earth and the human soul. The Elyon, the black gods, the vigilantes, the Neteru, as you want to call them, were deeply connected with the ancestral spirituality of the peoples. They brought wisdom, connection with the cycles of nature, understanding of the stars, the body, the spirit. They represented an integrated, free, plural spirituality, but that was too dangerous for those who wanted to centralize religious power. Yahweh's revelation as the only God required the destruction of all that came before. Altars were knocked down, set on fire, murdered priests, and the deities that were once revered as protectors and teachers began to be called false gods. Some were demonized, others deleted, others rewritten in negative roles, but all of them, without exception, represent a piece of a spiritual memory that the system tried to erase. Żyjemy w niezwykle trudnych czasach, w których proroctwa się spełniają, lecz wiele osób dziś nie zdaje sobie sprawy z tego, co dzieje się on świeci. Dlatego udostępnił mój odkrywając apokalipsę, który możesz natychmiast poprzez pierwszy przypięty komentarz. Taksista pomoże ci z gębiciami wszystkie tajemnice apokalipsy i odmieni